The late morning light of a cold day in early December of 1944 never reached the forest floor east of the Roer River. Even at midday, the pine canopy filtered the sun into a dim, green-tinted glow that made the German gunners of the leichte Flak-Abteilung feel as if they were fighting inside a cathedral made of trees and frozen mud. Frost clung to the edges of their steel helmets, and every breath rose in thin white ribbons that dissolved into the air before reaching the shattered trunks around them. In the distance, through the muffled corridors of the Hürtgen Forest, came the steady thump of American artillery, slow, rhythmic, impersonal. The men had become so used to that sound that they barely flinched when the earth groaned under another impact. What none of them expected, what none of them had been trained to handle, was the sound that followed a distant, rising thunder that grew with unnatural speed, like an approaching storm compressed into seconds. Obergefreiter Ernst Möller, a 23-year-old gunner who had operated the same 20mm Flakvierling for nearly 3 years, stepped away from the ammunition crate and stared upward instinctively, even though the forest ceiling hid most of the sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He felt the vibration before he saw the aircraft. A deep, resonant tremor ran through the frozen ground, rattling the bolts of the gun mount. One of the younger assistants muttered that it must be a heavy bomber formation headed toward Düren or Cologne. But Möller had heard enough engines in his life to recognize something different. Heavy bombers carried a long, droning note, a blanket of sound that rolled across the sky like slow ocean waves. This was sharper, harder, angrier, 8 engines in tight synchronization, but not from 4 aircraft. The note was higher pitched, overlapping, almost serrated. Seconds later, the first blur appeared through the tops of the pines, an impossibly fast grey shape with the flash of a red cowling and the distinctive broad wings that German soldiers near the Western Front had come to dread. A Republic P-47, Thunderbolt, diving low in the classic Razare attack profile American pilots used in the forest, slicing between the treetops with reckless confidence. Then a second. And a third. Within moments, the entire squad could see them, 8 aircraft flying a staggered, descending pattern along the ridgeline, their long barrels protruding from the wings like the teeth of some mechanical beast. Möller's first instinct was the same one drilled into every German light flak operator since basic training. Track the lead aircraft, aim ahead of the nose, fire in controlled bursts. But even as his hands moved, a sickening realization flashed across his mind. These thunderbolts were too low, too fast. The narrow sliver of sky above their position barely allowed a 30-degree firing arc, and every pilot seemed to know exactly how to pass through the dead zone where the Flakvierling's traverse slowed. It took only another heartbeat for the first aircraft to open fire. The sound was unlike anything the men had ever heard before, not the hammering rattle of German machine guns, not the deep thump of a 20mm cannon, but a rolling, continuous roar that blended into one unbroken note. 64 American Browning heavy machine guns firing at once, each spitting half-inch rounds at a rate that vibrated the air into something that felt alive. The forest canopy erupted, branches disintegrated, bark exploded from tree trunks in horizontal geysers. The P-47s did not simply strafe the clearing, they harvested it. The men dived for cover, but the Thunderbolt pilots were not guessing at their targets. They had studied aerial photographs of the gun positions for days. They flew with infantry spotters on the ground. And they had learned, across months of bitter fighting in the hedgerows of France and Belgium, exactly what a 20mm gun pit looked like from 300 yards. As splinters rained down on him, Möller's central question flashed with sudden clarity. How could any flak crew survive this? How could any German gun expect to stop 8 aircraft whose combined firepower exceeded anything the Luftwaffe itself had ever placed on a single fighter? That was the moment when the belief he had carried since his first day at a battery school near Kassel, the belief that German flak, the Reich's so-called iron umbrella, could repel anything, finally cracked. The reality that replaced it would take months to fully understand. But the breaking began in that brief, deafening minute as the thunderbolts passed overhead with perfect coordination, dragging forest debris in their wake like the prow of a ship cutting through surf. And as the last aircraft climbed away, leaving smoke drifting between the shattered trees, Möller stood up slowly, stunned by what he did not see. No aircraft had fallen, no pilot had even altered course. Their flak, once feared, once praised in propaganda as the most disciplined air defense network in Europe, had not drawn a single corrective maneuver from the attackers. It would take the Germans another several weeks to admit openly what every gunner on that ridge had sensed instinctively. Against the P-47 in its ground attack role, light flak, especially 20mm weapons, was becoming a psychological comfort rather than a battlefield tool. Long before the Hürtgen Forest bled into the Ardennes, that truth had begun to surface. But this event revealed it in its rawest form. Only after the aircraft disappeared did the men notice the disturbing stillness that followed, the kind of silence that felt less like calm and more like judgment. Möller looked at the bent barrels of the Flakvierling, each scorched and dotted with shrapnel from exploding tree limbs. The ammunition crates had been shredded. The gun captain's coat lay in tatters where he had thrown himself to the ground. Yet, miraculously, the men were alive. That, too, hinted at something unsettling. The Americans had not needed to kill them, to neutralize them. They simply tore the battery apart and moved on, confident the Luftwaffe could not interfere and no German armoured column would rise in retaliation. What Möller could not yet grasp was that this attack was part of a larger shift, one that had begun not in the dark forests of the Western Front, but in the factories and training schools far behind both lines. To understand why 8 American fighters could tear apart a veteran flak position without losing a single plane, one must return to an earlier year, long before the Hürtgen, before Aachen, before even Normandy. Back to a time when the Reich still believed its air defences were unassailable. For German anti-aircraft doctrine, the war had begun with confidence, too much of it. In 1939, through the early campaigns, the Luftwaffe's success over Poland and France led to an institutional belief that the Reich possessed not only superior pilots and aircraft, but also superior ground-based defences. The Fliegendes 88, the feared 88mm gun, had won a reputation as a symbol of German engineering supremacy. Its perceived ability to shoot down anything, bombers, fighters, tanks, gave soldiers a sense of technological invincibility. Even the smaller weapons, like the twin 20mm Flakvierling and the quad-mounted Flakvierling, were praised as unmatched in rate of fire and reliability. By the time the war turned westward in 1942 and 1943, propaganda had shaped this belief into a myth. The massive flak towers in cities like Berlin, Vienna, and Hamburg were held up as proof of the Reich's shield, the Himmelsfestung, the fortress of the sky. Pamphlets circulated among the batteries, insisting that disciplined German gunnery, combined with the precision of optical rangefinders and predictors, would nullify Allied air power. Radio broadcasts spoke of British and American aircraft falling in flames under the righteous fire of the fatherland's defenders. But these claims left out a crucial truth. German flak doctrine had been built primarily around defending fixed positions against medium and high-altitude bombing. It was not designed to fight a new kind of enemy, a single-seat ground attack fighter that could dive at hundreds of miles per hour, deliver devastating firepower in seconds, and escape before the gunners could even align their sights. The Reich did not fully appreciate this vulnerability until the summer of 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy and the P-47's ground attack role surged into dominance. The P-4 Thunderbolt, once mocked as too large and too heavy for air combat, became the hammer of the Allied advance. Its 8 heavy machine guns, each fed by a belt of several hundred rounds, had proven ideal for anti-armour, anti-transport, and close support roles. And its radial engine, lacking fragile coolant lines, made it extraordinarily resistant to light flak hits. German infantry accounts from Normandy describe the same unnerving pattern: a whistling descent, a flash of wingtips as the Thunderbolt levelled out, then the thunder of Browning guns that tore through hedgerows, wooden barns, and truck columns with equal ease. Even panzer commanders respected the aircraft. not because a half-inch bullet could penetrate heavy armor from most angles, but because the Americans rarely attacked alone. A strafing run with 8 thunderbolts meant 64 guns firing overlapping streams of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition. Tracks were severed, optics shattered, crew hatches jammed, supply vehicles exploded. The tank might survive, but the formation no longer functioned. Meanwhile, German gunners, especially those operating 20mm and 37mm weapons, faced logistical constraints they had never imagined earlier in the war. Ammunition supplies shrank. Replacement barrels became scarce. Radar-assisted fire control was reserved for home defense units, not frontline batteries. And the most devastating change of all, the Luftwaffe was no longer present in the skies to support them. By the autumn of 1944, the Reich had lost so many experienced pilots that entire sectors of the Western Front went days without seeing a single German fighter. A flak gun without friendly air cover was like an archer standing alone in a clearing, firing at mounted cavalry. So when 8 thunderbolts swept over Möller's position that morning, the event was not the beginning of a revelation, but the culmination of one. The gunners' belief in the strength of their weapons, rooted in training manuals written in a different era, collided with the operational reality of late-war air power. Their 20mm cannon could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, yes, but only if the gun survived long enough to fire, and only if the aircraft flew within a window that lasted more than a fraction of a second, and only if the gunner could track a target nearly twice as fast as the Stukas and Il-2 aircraft they had trained to shoot at. Even the vaunted 88mm gun, effective at higher altitudes, could not traverse quickly enough to engage a thunderbolt, making a low-level, high-speed pass. German manuals acknowledged this openly, stating that heavy flak was not designed for rapid engagement of strafing fighters. But such nuance never made it into the propaganda films shown to the batteries. As the winter deepened and the fighting shifted toward the Ardennes, these contradictions intensified. Newly arrived flak crews, some, barely 18 years old, found themselves confronting the brutal truth. Their weapons, though deadly in ideal circumstances, were increasingly mismatched against the type of air attacks dominating the Western Front. Möller himself had sensed this growing tension even before that December morning. He had read after-action reports describing thunderbolts absorbing multiple 20mm hits and still returning to base. He had heard veterans mutter about the radial engine's resilience, its ability to continue running even with cylinders blown open, but he dismissed these as exaggerations. Soldiers always embellished stories. Confidence required dismissal. The attack that morning left no room for dismissal. The moment the last P-47 vanished over the tree line, the truth hung in the air like gun smoke. Their flak had not been defeated. It had been bypassed, rendered irrelevant by a machine designed in a different industrial universe. What happened next, in the hours and days that followed, would harden this realization into certainty. But already, even in that brief window between the passing aircraft and the return of distant artillery, Möller felt something he had not felt since joining the flak arm. He felt small, not personally, not as a soldier, but as a component of a system that no longer matched the battlefield it served. This was the beginning of the psychological shift, a quiet fracture in belief that spread through the battery like a slow, cold seep of groundwater. A recognition that the Reich's iron umbrella no longer covered them, and that the sky above now belonged to an enemy who understood the battlefield in ways Germany had not prepared for. Everything that followed, every destroyed supply column, every strafed road junction, every failed attempt to repel Jabos, would build on this moment. And as the men repaired their shattered gun mount, salvaging what little equipment remained intact, none of them could shake a simple question they had never asked before that day. If their flak could not stop a thunderbolt, what could? The days that followed the attack on Möller's position became a slow lesson in humility for the German gunners. Reports filtered in from the front lines, compiled by the Feldluftgau commandos, detailing the sheer persistence and resilience of the P-47 in combat. Reconnaissance photographs, once meant to reassure the batteries about defensive coverage, now served as grim evidence. Each airstrip and supply corridor targeted by American fighter bombers showed repeated devastation. Vehicles were incinerated, trains derailed, and even camouflaged fuel depots lay smouldering, their destruction traced to a single pass of multiple thunderbolts. German ground commanders began to recognize an operational truth that no doctrine manual had prepared them for. Light flak, the weapon system they had relied upon for years, was functionally impotent against coordinated fighter-bomber formations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Möller and his colleagues began comparing notes with nearby batteries, sharing what little they could about timing, altitude, and attack angles. They discovered a pattern. The Americans rarely engaged in prolonged passes. Unlike the bombers of early campaigns, which required multiple volleys to overwhelm defenses, Thunderbolts combined extreme speed with overwhelming firepower. Each aircraft carried 8 Browning heavy machine guns, each loaded with belts of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. A single pass through a gun position could deliver over 8,000 rounds within seconds. The implications for the German crews were immediate. Even a direct hit on the gunners could be fatal, but even without a casualty, the guns themselves were often rendered inoperable by splinter damage. The operational psychology of the attack was just as devastating as the material reality. Veterans like Obergefreiter Möller noticed a subtle but insidious effect. After witnessing one pass, gunners hesitated before reloading. The instinctive fear of being strafed during the brief window of re-engagement disrupted the rhythm that German flak doctrine relied upon. The once mechanized efficiency of the batteries trained for high-speed aiming and precise firebursts now faltered under the mental strain of an unseen, almost untouchable adversary. To understand why these aircraft proved so effective, one must examine the technical and tactical design of the P-47. The Thunderbolt's radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, produced nearly 2,000 horsepower in its standard configuration, with early combat versions exceeding 2,300. Unlike liquid-cooled engines used in most German and British fighters, the radial engine was far more tolerant of light flak strikes. Multiple cylinders could fail without causing immediate loss of thrust, allowing the aircraft to continue its attack run despite sustaining hundreds of rounds in the cowling or wing roots. Its air-cooled design also negated vulnerabilities that the Luftwaffe exploited in fighters such as the Focke-Wulf Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt Bf 109, where a single coolant line hit could force an immediate crash landing. Armament, too, played a central role in reshaping the battlefield. 8 Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns, mounted in the wings, provided a convergence zone calibrated for ground attack. Pilots were trained to adjust the gun harmonization for optimal impact at distances ranging from 100 to 400 yards. In practice, this allowed concentrated fire that could penetrate light and medium armor, sever fuel lines, destroy optical devices, and shred personnel with minimal risk to the pilot. German field reports repeatedly emphasized the psychological shock of this firepower. Survivors described feeling as if a continuous wall of bullets had swept through their position, not aimed but everywhere, a phrase repeated in reports from Aachen to the Roer River. The industrial context behind the Thunderbolt's dominance is equally significant. By 1944, the United States had optimized its production lines to deliver high-quality, durable aircraft in numbers that Germany could not match. Republic Aviation, the manufacturer of the P-47, produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts by the end of the year, with additional units supplied by other contracted factories. This logistical abundance allowed the U.S. Army Air Forces to employ the aircraft aggressively in ground attack missions without concern for losses that might cripple operational tempo. For German flak crews, this created a scenario where even a successful engagement, rare as it was, could not alter the overall strategic reality. The Thunderbolt could absorb damage, return to base, and be replaced with another, leaving flak units perpetually under pressure. Möller recalled reading post-combat analyses issued by the Luftwaffe, often circulated in paraphrased form to frontline units. One report, compiled in September of 1944 by the Flak Corps, evaluated American fighter-bomber losses versus German ground fire effectiveness in the Normandy and Rhineland campaigns. The figures were stark. For every 4 to 5 Thunderbolts shot down in concentrated operations, over 60 missions succeeded in destroying key German positions with negligible aircraft losses. The report's conclusion, understated yet devastating, stated that current light anti-aircraft systems are inadequate against rapid low-altitude, heavily armed fighters. This was the official recognition of a truth Möller had already experienced firsthand. Flak could no longer guarantee protection. The training and doctrine of the German flak crews contributed to the problem. Soldiers were drilled extensively on theoretical fire arcs, lead calculations, and range estimations, often using mock attacks with older aircraft models or towed target sleeves. These exercises assumed predictable approach vectors and slower speeds. Thunderbolts did not conform to these assumptions. Their dive and zoom tactics, high-altitude dives converted into rapid, low-level strafing runs, rendered classical calculations almost irrelevant. Even experienced gunners, proficient with targeting computers and manual predictors, struggled to maintain consistent hits. An 18-year-old recruit could fire hundreds of rounds without making meaningful contact, an outcome that demoralized units trained for precision and efficiency. As winter approached, the German High Command attempted incremental adjustments. Batteries were repositioned to forest edges, attempting to exploit concealment while maximizing field of fire. Auxiliary spotting units were introduced, using both visual and rudimentary radar detection to track low-level approaches. Ammunition belts were preloaded, and gun crews were instructed to fire in rapid succession to create suppression zones. Despite these measures, the psychological impact of repeated Thunderbolt strikes persisted. Survivors reported hesitation, miscommunication, and frozen reactions during actual attacks, evidence that the combination of speed, mass, and concentrated firepower was as effective in breaking morale as it was in destroying materiel. It was not only the German gunners' perceptions that had to shift. Commanders, from battery captains to flak battalion officers, faced a fundamental re-evaluation of operational priorities. Previously, they could assume that fixed and mobile anti-aircraft installations would create a safe corridor for ground operations. Thunderbolt raids invalidated these assumptions. German tactical manuals, updated sporadically during the war, offered little guidance on countering high-speed, low-altitude fighter bombers with superior firepower and resilient airframes. Some commanders resorted to overly conservative measures, withdrawing flak to protect crews rather than cover advancing units, an ironic inversion of doctrine in which defensive systems limited their own strategic utility. Möller's battery, over the course of December 1944, faced repeated engagements of this kind. Each attack reinforced the same conclusion. Flak was no longer an instrument of control, but a warning of vulnerability. The psychological impact on the crew was cumulative. Letters sent home describe a palpable shift from confident assertion to muted concern. Where once they spoke of skill and discipline as guarantees of survival, they now referred to luck and timing. Survivors emphasized the Thunderbolt's resilience, the destructive certainty of its weapons, and the futility of conventional anti-aircraft measures. Some accounts, written in the quiet hours after patrols, mention specific aircraft identification numbers, suggesting the pilot's ability to return repeatedly to the same positions, a practice impossible to counter without mobile air superiority. Yet the story of the Thunderbolt's supremacy was not only one of hardware, it was also a story of doctrine, training, and adaptation. American pilots flying these missions underwent rigorous instruction in low-level navigation, target identification, and cooperative attack formations. Pilots trained at bases in England and liberated France learned to exploit terrain, tree lines, and roads to maximize both effect and survivability. They practiced timed approaches, using overlapping fire zones to ensure coverage while minimizing exposure. This combination of industrial capacity, engineering resilience, and tactical preparation amplified the aircraft's lethality far beyond what a casual observer might assume from its sheer size and armament. By the end of December 1944, German commanders had been forced to reassess both their weapons systems and their strategies. A single statement from the Flakkommandantur in Aachen captures the sentiment. The effectiveness of small-caliber flak against massed, low-flying fighter bombers is negligible. The risk to personnel is disproportionate to potential success. This acknowledgement marked a departure from early war confidence in light and medium flak as a primary defense against tactical air threats. For gunners like Möller, it was confirmation of the lesson learned on that frost-covered December morning. Sometimes, survival was less about skill and more about accepting limits imposed by material reality. The broader strategic consequences of these encounters would ripple through the final months of the war. American air superiority, built on robust aircraft design, coordinated tactics, and logistical abundance, allowed for persistent harassment of German supply lines, reinforcements, and command centers. Batteries that might have defended against earlier generations of aircraft now faced the moral and practical dilemma of exposure versus action. By mid-January 1945, reports from the western sectors repeatedly noted abandoned flak positions, destroyed or relocated, unable to counter the continuous stream of Thunderbolt sorties supporting ground operations in the Ardennes and Rhineland. The psychological defeat, the recognition of impotence, matched the material one. Yet, even within this bleak context, German reports do not describe complete despair. There is a recurring emphasis on ingenuity, improvisation, and resilience. Crews modified emplacements, constructed rudimentary armor, and coordinated with infantry to create makeshift air warning systems. These measures, while unable to neutralize the Thunderbolt threat, illustrate a human dimension, the capacity to adapt and endure in the face of overwhelming technological and tactical superiority. Möller himself, years later, would recount in interviews how these incremental innovations became part of daily routine, a silent acknowledgement of what could be done, even if it was insufficient. The irony, unspoken but pervasive among the gunners, lay in the contrast between perception and reality. For years, German training emphasized flak as the linchpin of air defense. Manuals, propaganda, and early combat successes reinforced a belief in technological invincibility. Yet here, in the cold forests east of the Roer River, 8 American fighters armed with 64 heavy machine guns had rendered that confidence hollow. The lesson was clear. Superior design, tactical foresight, and industrial capacity could overcome even well-trained, experienced defenders. And while the Americans never intended to teach a moral lesson, their presence in the skies imposed one with absolute clarity. As the battery settled into another long, silent night, Möller could not have known that his experience would echo across thousands of similar positions. From Aachen to the Ardennes, from small flak batteries to heavily fortified positions guarding river crossings, the practical truth became undeniable. Conventional flak, for all its mechanical precision, was no match for the combined engineering and tactical acumen represented by the P-47. Survival and effectiveness were now dictated less by courage or training than by understanding and respecting the aircraft that dominated the skies. In this, the Thunderbolt story was not only one of raw power but also of systemic transformation. The Allies had combined material resilience, overwhelming firepower, and operational discipline into a single instrument capable of rewriting battlefield expectations. For the German gunners, each engagement reinforced the same uncomfortable fact. The myth of invincible flak had been shattered, not by one catastrophic strike, but by the relentless, methodical application of what was technologically and tactically superior. The new year of 1945 brought with it both bitter cold and a bitterer reality for the German defenders of the Western Front. The Hürtgen Forest, the Roer River crossings, and the surrounding villages had become familiar sites of repeated Thunderbolt strikes. By January, even senior officers were acknowledging a truth that frontline gunners like Obergefreiter Möller had intuited months earlier. Their 20mm and 37mm guns were, against these aircraft, largely ceremonial. The implications were both tactical and strategic. Units were no longer just fighting the P-47s themselves, They were fighting the logistical and psychological consequences of knowing their weapons were inadequate. Reports compiled by the Flak Corps in early 1945 reveal a systematic assessment of the threat. Casualty figures were sobering. Entire batteries were rendered ineffective within the first passes of coordinated 8-plane Thunderbolt formations. One such report from a battery near Jülich notes, out of 4 batteries deployed to cover the main supply corridor, 3 were temporarily disabled after a single attack lasting under 90 seconds. Ammunition was destroyed, barrels warped, and personnel were incapacitated by splinter injuries. The language, clinical and measured, concealed a deeper alarm. Flak was no longer a strategic equalizer, but a reactive and ultimately fragile tool. For Möller's unit, the adaptation to this reality took practical form. Crews began experimenting with new deployment techniques. Guns were dug deeper into the forest floor, camouflaged with broken branches and tarpaulin, and operators worked in staggered shifts to maintain constant vigilance while minimizing exposure. Ammunition was distributed across multiple points to prevent a single pass from eliminating all firepower. Observers attempted to anticipate approach vectors based on terrain, wind, and past encounters. Yet, even with these measures, the psychological toll remained evident. Letters from flak crews home to relatives frequently mention fear as a constant companion. One young gunner, barely 18, wrote, "We know the guns will not stop them. We only hope they do not see us in time." The tactical ingenuity of the Germans, however, was matched by the Americans' operational rigor. Thunderbolt pilots trained to fly in tight, staggered formations, optimizing overlapping fields of fire so that each pass maximized effect while minimizing risk. Even in the dense cover of the Hürtgen Forest, they maintained altitude discipline and precise spacing, a testament to both pilot skill and coordinated planning. Aircraft maintenance crews on the Allied side ensured that engines could absorb the stress of repeated low-level attacks, and gunners were trained to read terrain cues, adjust fire convergence, and execute rapid egress maneuvers without sacrificing accuracy. The result was a near-perfect synergy between design, armament, and tactical doctrine. One particular engagement, recorded in the diaries of Oberleutnant Klaus Weber, illustrates the stark contrast between expectation and reality. Weber commanded a Flakvierling battery tasked with defending a vital bridge near Hürtgen in late January 1945. His post-action report, meticulously logged in handwriting still legible decades later, recounts the sequence of events. 8 Thunderbolts approached at approximately 300 yards above the treetops, staggered in formation. The battery opened fire, expending nearly 1,000 rounds. The enemy, Weber wrote, did not deviate. The fire struck trees, earth, and even the barrels of our own weapons. No aircraft were hit. The attack lasted under 30 seconds. He concluded with a terse acknowledgement. Our guns were useless in the presence of their speed and firepower. It is a bitter truth that cannot be mitigated by courage alone. Weber's observation echoed across the Western Front. German commanders, from the battery level to the divisional level, were forced to reconcile years of doctrine with operational reality. Light and medium flak, once considered the backbone of the Reich's anti-aircraft defences, now required either supplementation with heavier systems or avoidance of critical targets altogether. Some batteries were withdrawn from frontline exposure, others assigned only to secondary objectives. In each case, the psychological impact, the acknowledgement that their skill and training could not compensate for technological disparity, was as consequential as the material effect on the battlefield. Historians examining these encounters note a subtle but significant point. The American success against flak positions was not solely the product of overwhelming firepower or speed. It was also a function of strategic patience and industrial preparation. The United States, by 1944, possessed a production capacity capable sustaining losses without affecting operational tempo. Thunderbolts could be repaired quickly, replaced in weeks, and employed with consistency. This created a feedback loop in which German flak crews, already psychologically strained, faced the certainty of repeated attacks with little opportunity for rest or recovery. As one veteran recorded in a post-war memoir, "We could survive one pass, perhaps two, but the third or fourth day of constant attacks broke morale more than it broke guns." By the time the Ardennes offensive commenced in December 1944, the full consequences of this dynamic were apparent. American Thunderbolt formations disrupted German supply lines, strafed infantry concentrations, and neutralized artillery positions with impunity. Reports from frontline units detail the systematic destruction of transport columns, vehicles immobilized by machine gun fire, fuel dumps ignited, and bridges temporarily rendered impassable. Even elite German formations, such as the Waffen-SS Panzer units, found themselves delayed and disoriented by the combination of Thunderbolt speed, firepower, and precision targeting. The ability of light flak to intervene effectively was almost entirely negated. The story of Möller's battery and others like it demonstrates a larger theme: the interaction of technology, doctrine, and human psychology in warfare. Flak crews were highly trained, experienced, and disciplined, yet faced with a system they had not been prepared to counter, they were forced into improvisation and adaptation. The Thunderbolt did not merely destroy targets, it reshaped the battlefield in a way that forced recognition of limitations long assumed to be theoretical. For the gunners, survival required not mastery over the aircraft, but an understanding of its patterns and vulnerabilities, a lesson that came too late to restore the efficacy of their weapons. The long-term consequences extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Post-war analysis by both Allied and German historians has emphasized the role of the P-47 in establishing Allied air dominance over the Western Front. Its durability, firepower, and adaptability allowed for persistent interdiction operations, which in turn contributed materially to the failure of German offensives and the stabilization of front lines in late 1944 and early 1945. Air superiority enabled strategic bombing, close air support, and rapid troop movement, creating a compounded effect in which each Thunderbolt sortie amplified both psychological and operational pressure on German forces. Möller's reflections, recorded in interviews decades later, capture the human dimension of these events. He spoke of fear, awe, and reluctant respect for the pilots who executed these attacks. "We trained for years to shoot down planes," he recalled, "and yet they came over again and again. It was not just that our guns failed, it was that we realized the rules had changed, and we were no longer the arbiters of the sky." His acknowledgement underscores a central paradox of the engagement. Technological and tactical mastery can achieve dominance not merely through destruction, but by imposing a new operational reality that cannot be resisted through tradition or skill alone. This psychological dimension has been confirmed through numerous post-war accounts. German soldiers and officers consistently describe a sense of inevitability when confronted by P-47 formations. Even if a single battery survived an attack unscathed, the expectation of repeated, unavoidable assaults generated tension, hesitation, and operational caution. In other words, the Thunderbolt achieved effects beyond immediate physical damage. It altered behavior, decision-making, and morale at multiple levels of command. For the historians reconstructing these events, the encounters between German Flak and American Thunderbolts illustrate a broader principle of late-war operations. The interplay of industrial capacity, tactical doctrine, and technological resilience often dictated outcomes as decisively as front-line engagements. While human bravery and skill remained vital, they could not substitute for systemic advantages engineered across design, production, and training. The P-47, in this context, was not merely an aircraft but an instrument of operational transformation. By the spring of 1945, German flak crews faced the same lesson repeatedly. In the presence of overwhelming air power, traditional doctrines could not ensure survival. Batteries were often abandoned, repositioned, or stripped of personnel to meet other needs. Möller, by then assigned to a reserve battery near Cologne, noted with grim resignation that entire positions were evacuated before a single American aircraft appeared. The realization was profound. The battlefield had changed permanently, and the assumptions that had guided training, deployment, and morale for half a decade were no longer valid. Yet even in defeat, there was learning. Crews experimented with concealment, camouflage, and coordination with remaining Luftwaffe fighters to mitigate losses. Engineers studied patterns of thunderbolt attacks, modifying barrels and emplacement angles where possible. In this way, the operational lesson, survival through adaptation rather than confrontation, was internalized. It was a bitter knowledge, gained at a high cost, but it represented the only viable path for crews facing an opponent whose combination of speed, firepower, and industrial depth rendered conventional countermeasures obsolete. The broader legacy of these engagements extends into both historical memory and military doctrine. Analysts of mid to late 20th century conflicts frequently cite the P-47s' interdiction of German flak as an early example of how air power can neutralize entrenched defensive networks without necessarily achieving mass destruction. In this sense, the experience of Möller and his comrades prefigures principles of modern aerial suppression of enemy air defenses, where speed, concentrated firepower, and resilience render previously formidable defensive systems largely irrelevant. For Möller, personally, the experience shaped his post-war reflections on war, technology, and human limitations. He emphasized that skill and courage remained essential, but that recognition of systemic realities, industrial capacity, aircraft design, tactical integration was equally critical. "We were brave," he said, "and we knew how to aim and fire, but the sky belonged to them, not because we lacked courage, but because the rules had changed, and we had not kept up." His words encapsulate the essential irony that framed the entire episode. Trained, disciplined, and experienced gunners confronted a weapon system so advanced in conception and execution that all prior assumptions about capability and survival were rendered obsolete. Ultimately, the story of 8 Thunderbolts versus a single Flakvierling battery illuminates both the human and material dimensions of late-war combat. It reveals the interplay of design, tactics, and industrial scale in determining outcomes, and highlights the profound psychological shifts imposed on defenders forced to confront the limits of their training and equipment. Above all, it underscores a truth that resonates through military history. The most effective weapon is not merely the one that destroys the most targets, but the one that reshapes the battlefield itself, rendering outdated doctrines and entrenched assumptions irrelevant. In the forest east of the Roer River, on that cold December morning, Obergefreiter Möller and his comrades learned a lesson that extended far beyond the reach of their guns. The P-47 had not only survived flak, it had rewritten the rules of engagement, and the men who fired at it, once confident in their mastery of the skies, could only bear witness to the reality of a weapon designed to dominate, endure, and redefine the meaning of air combat in the last year of the war. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.